Hey. Welcome back to Pod Logic presented by Straight Up Podcasts. I'm your host, Johnny Peterson, and today I wanted to go over Monday's newsletter and touch on this whole concept of not complicating your podcast, as well as some quick tips to improve your show notes. And it'll be a quick one, so we'll dive right into it. So the new year is upon us. It's 2021. 2020 is in the past, thank God. And most of us are probably pretty gung-ho about our New Year's resolutions, probably a lot more than usual. And in the context of you hosting your podcast, your mind is probably running a million miles an hour trying to figure out the best way to improve your podcast and how to make this year your small female dog. I'll let you interpret that. But let's remember that trying to implement too many changes at once is a great way to potentially screw up the momentum that your show has going into 2021. So if your show is seeing growth or you're achieving this goal that you set out with when you started your podcast, don't go reinventing the wheel, because podcasting is a long distance sport. The audience growth of the whole thing takes time, dedication, and making a bunch of aesthetic changes like changing your cover art and changing your intro and outro music, and maybe even changing the topic of your podcast just because you think you need to make some tweaks. Doing all of that overnight isn't going to get you to where you want to be. And you NBA fans will get a kick out of this quote: trust the process. Trust the process. Keep doing what you're doing. It's fine to make minor tweaks here and there, but making sort of an overhaul shift of your entire image overnight, that is, I think, detrimental overall to your podcast. So we'll dive into ways that you can improve your show notes. So this is something that's very easy without changing the complete aesthetic of your podcast. You can change your show notes to create a lot more value for your podcast audience and just for the piece of content that you're putting out there, just increasing its ability to have an impact on people. So the first one, I'm going to link you to a video in the description of this video and the description of the podcast. It's a great video on how to quickly get more value from your show notes for the podcast. Now, don't be turned off by the host's he's being kind of a dick in the beginning to you if you're a podcaster. So just grind through that. And he has some really awesome tips. It is from Copywriting Course. I believe his first name is Neville. So the link to that video is in the description. The second tip for improving your show notes is plugging your guest. So obviously your guest is incentivized a little bit to come onto your show because they now have a platform, your audience, to sort of spread their message and get their personal awareness up. That's a small part of why they would come on your podcast. And I mean, it's a simple value add just to plug your guests. I mean, again, like I said, it's part of why they're coming on the show. And this doesn't really require more than just a simple email to ask each guest for the following links and then just add those into your show description. Like, what social media profile do you want our listeners to engage with you on? Is it your Twitter profile? Is it your Facebook? Is it your Instagram? Have those links ready to go in the show description so people can easily find that guest and that person. So the next question would be, do you have a website that you want listeners to go to? Maybe your guest is the CEO of a company. Maybe he or she is a startup founder or somebody, and they have a website that they want to plug. Have that in there as well. And then finally, do you have a book, podcast, or something interesting for listeners to go check out? If they're trying to promote a podcast, maybe they're releasing a book and your podcast is part of their sort of book tour. That's a really big thing in podcasting right now. Be sure to plug everything because, again, I've talked about this in previous podcasts, previous videos. You want your guests to have an incredible experience coming on your show, and to not do that for them doesn't really incentivize them to promote your content with them, even if it features them. Unless you're plugging them in some kind of way, it's sort of a give and take of, hey, you're coming on my podcast, I'll help promote you, I'll make it a great experience for you, and you in turn are going to share it on social media with your following and hopefully bring some new listeners to my podcast. Final tip for improving your show notes is just hyperlink the important stuff that you talk about. So inevitably, in a 45-minute long podcast interview or just conversation with a guest, it's going to lead to either me as the host or you as the guest mentioning a book, a Netflix series, a podcast, a person that contributes to some of the big ideas that we discussed. And yeah, it takes a little bit of extra time, but in the long run, having links to all of those really important things that you mentioned for your audience to see and check out right away is a huge value add for them in the long term. So those are some quick ways that you can improve your show notes and just some things to think about in terms of not overcomplicating your podcast. I appreciate you watching. If you would be so kind to consider subscribing, like, share the video. I know that I would really appreciate it. And I know that if you did the same thing with your favorite YouTuber, they would really appreciate it as well. You can also subscribe to the podcast, PodLogic, or check out my website at straightuppodcasts.com.